Welcome back. And what we're going to take a look at today is the fifth topic of the seventh unit, which is going to focus on unresolved colonial tensions after World War One, but before World War Two. So, when we start into this lecture, one of the things we want to focus on is that World War One challenged many assumptions of the 19th century. As we saw in the last topic, it started to challenge the idea of the laissez-faire economic system as being the way to go with economics. It also challenged World War One, challenged the idea that Europe was making the most progress of any civilization. This brutal war showed that maybe progress was not everything it was cracked up to be. So World War One is a challenge to everything the 19th century world held true, except for colonization. World War One does not undo colonization. In fact, the European powers, Britain and France, doubled down on the concept of a colonial empire. So you would think that World War One would challenge the colonial systems. But what it did was it made Europe double down on it, which is only going to encourage nationalist groups to redouble their efforts at resistance. Because the idea that resistance to the imperial system begins here in the interwar years is to neglect all the examples we've seen before. So let's look at the colonial subjects under the Allies. So the Allies are, of course, going to be focused on Britain and France. And during World War One, the colonial subjects supported the British and the French. They answered the call to action to come serve the mother country and to provide service to the empire. So, soldiers from African colonies, soldiers from South Asia, soldiers from Southeast Asia, all enlisted to support both the British and the French. And the hope was that by serving the Allies in this war effort, they would be rewarded with freedom, that they would be rewarded with recognition of independence or at least greater autonomy, a loosening of colonial restraints. So when we look at number two, the response to the post World War One settlement is one of disappointment and almost a feeling of betrayal. So here we have Indian soldiers, Vietnamese soldiers, soldiers from Kenya, soldiers from Senegal, who Algerian soldiers who sign up to serve the French and the British. And when they come back home, they find that the colonial situation is still in place. They're expecting greater self determination, greater freedoms, and they end up with quite the opposite. We'll talk about how that plays in a moment. Meanwhile, colonial subjects in Germany, as well as in the Ottoman Empire, what happens to these lands is that they end up becoming mandates of the League of Nations. If you remember to the asynchronous learning, a mandate is basically an area or a region governed by the League of Nations and administered by one of the member nations of the League. So you have colonies of Germany who suddenly find themselves being administered by British and French colonial administrations. You have the former Middle East lands of the Ottoman Empire now governed by Britain and France. So while we use the term mandate, in truth, this is just a colony by another name. And that is going to spark an anti imperial sentiment because to the people in the Middle East and to the people throughout the former German colonies in Africa, they see this as just changing places. For the Arabs in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire has been replaced by the British and the French. The Turks have been replaced by the British and the French. For the people of Angola, for Tanzania, African colonies under German rule, the Germans have just been replaced by the British or the French. So really nothing new has changed. And that's going to encourage more anti-imperial sentiment. So that brings me to this growth of nationalist movements in the colonies. Now, what's important to remember is that nationalism had already been forming throughout the 19th century as a backlash to imperialism. And the thing you want to realize is that this nationalism solidifies in the 20th century. In other words, this interest of nationalist groups of working with the European powers in the hopes of kind of sharing power is going to start going to the wayside. And instead, what's going to emerge is a solely independent movement. In other words, these nationalist movements become much more geared towards getting rid of the Western presence and solidifying an independent state for themselves. And that's what we're going to watch play out throughout the 20th and the 21st century. So if we go to the next thing, we're going to now start looking at examples. I'm going to back up for 1 second. For this slide, this is the big picture. And if you can keep this big picture in mind, then you're going to be in good shape. All you have to do is apply it to some examples. India is the ideal example of all of this. Before World War I, there was a group called the Indian National Congress. And the Indian National Congress was agitating for greater autonomy and greater freedoms from the British rule. They wanted more of a say in the governing of the South Asian colony of India. When World War I breaks out, the Indian National Congress decides to support Britain. And Indian soldiers are going to sign up for military service under British command and participate in World War I on the side of the British. And again, the expectation is that the Indian National Congress hopes that this service will lead to greater autonomy and greater voice for the Indians in Indian affairs. However, what the British are going to end up doing is returning India to kind of a harsh rule and a harsh control. So after the war, that promised independence never emerges. And in fact, there are more rules and more restrictions that the British are placing on the Indians. And what this does is it starts to galvanize an anti British sentiment that was not necessarily there before World War I. There's a driving interest to get rid of the British presence altogether. And the event that really solidifies this attitude of an India free of British control is the Amritsar massacre. So in 1919, there is a protest and is taking place at a religious temple within India. Now, the British have a series of rules that forbid mass gatherings. So that when the British see this peaceful protest of Indians calling out for calling out for an end to British rule, for a reduction of British power in India, the British respond by shooting into the crowd, wounding thousands, actually a little bit more than 1,000. But this Amherst, and also you have death toll in about the hundreds. So the Amritsar massacre, what it does is it solidifies the Indian people or the people of South Asia to get rid of the British. So after this massacre, there is definitely a growth in the support for an India free of British control. So instead of working with the British to secure a greater Indian voice, the Indian nationalist movement is now developing into a movement to get rid of the British altogether. And the Amritsar massacre is a pivotal moment in the Indian nationalist development because now it's the British need to go attitude. Now, this is where Gandhi comes in and solidifies the movement into something unique, something different than we would see in other nationalist movements. What Gandhi calls for is a campaign of civil disobedience. So, what he advocates for are nonviolent ways of confronting the British. And what he says is that confrontation is necessary. You can't just stand by and let this happen. You have to confront, but you don't confront with violence, according to Gandhi. And the reasoning behind Gandhi's nonviolent approach is partially steeped within religious beliefs, but it's also steeped within a strategy because he knows that the rest of the world, if they see the British Empire kicking somebody who doesn't fight back, then eventually people will start taking the side of the people not fighting back. And when I say not fighting back, I'm talking about violence because Gandhi's civil disobedience is a form of fighting back. It's just non-violent. So Gandhi and his movement is going to organize boycotts of British goods. It's going to one of the most famous examples of this is the Salt March, where Gandhi walks to the ocean to take salt water and make his own salt so he can avoid paying the salt tax that the British has imposed. He is going to be arrested multiple times for his actions, but all the while he responds with a non-violent response, which makes the British look bad, to put it mildly. And all that does is solidify support for this Indian nationalist movement. The homespun movement is what this picture represents. You look at the picture, you see a spinning wheel there. And if you remember, one of the things that the British companies did was put into place restrictions on Indian textile industries. So Indian laborers would harvest cotton out of India, send it to British factories. British factories would spin that cotton into textiles and then sell those textiles back to the Indians. So in a way, Indians were supplying the resources to the British and then being forced to use their wages to buy the British made goods. What Gandhi calls for is the spinning and creation of one's own clothes in order to break the hold of the British textile industry over India. And so the homespun movement is definitely a movement of independence for the Indians, to be independent of the British textiles and to take control of their own lives. The other thing that we often forget with Gandhi is that Gandhi also advocated for social causes within India. One of the things that Gandhi called for was an end to the caste system, for example. Gandhi comes from the higher Brahmin caste, but he goes out of his way to be with people who are considered the untouchables, the people who are the social pariah of India. Another thing Gandhi advocates for is vegetarianism. So he also combines this willingness to challenge social injustice that he sees within the Indian society that's independent of the British. So he wants the British out, but he also wants an India that's rooted within social justice and Hindu values. He also calls for cooperation with the Muslim population. This is what's going to create a problem because the challenge of an independent India is that while 80% of the population would be Hindu, the other 20% is Muslim. And that creates a tension. Now, at the beginning, the Hindus and the Muslims work together because they both want the British out. But the Muslim League is going to come along and say, we want our own state so that the Muslims of this region can have their own government, their own state, their own voice. And this is a form of Muslim nationalism within South Asia. So there is a two-state solution. By the 1930s, it's becoming obvious that Britain is not going to hold on to India much longer. So a two-state solution is being built and negotiated. And the idea is that down the road, the British would withdraw from South Asia, and behind them would be the Indian state and the state of Pakistan. And the state of Pakistan would be that nation that the Muslim League wanted. And the state of India would be that state that the Indian National Congress wanted. However, World War II is going to get in the way of the implementation of that two state solution. So if we go to the next example, we go to East Asia, and we're going to talk about two areas, Korea and China. Now, Korea is under the control of the Japanese. So what Korea hoped is that World War I would sort of ease Japanese presence, and that doesn't happen. So Japan is in control of Korea. Korea wants Japan out. So there is a movement called the March 1st movement, which is a protest against the Japanese presence in Korea. The Japanese are going to brutally suppress this movement. However, the March 1st movement in Korea shows this Korean nationalism that's focused against Japan. And we're going to see Korean nationalism play out later in this course. When we go to China, China is going to have something very similar to the March 1st movement called the May 4th movement. And yes, for you Star Wars fans out there, I get it. That is, Star Wars is not around yet. But here's the thing is that for China, they took the side of the Allies. So what they hoped was that they would gain more control over their land. If you remember from previous units, China was losing control, and there was German colonies that used to be Chinese land. There was Japanese influence and Japanese dominance. What China is hoping for is to assert greater control over what they used to have control over. So during the Versailles negotiations, there's an island that used to belong to, or a peninsula that used to belong to Germany. Japan wants it, but China has had it in the past. And the Versailles Agreement is going to let Japan have this peninsula that China wants. So to China, they see this as an assault on Chinese nationalism. They see this as, the Western powers once again imposing their will and disregarding Chinese interests. They also see it as a Japanese aggression, Japanese expansion. So the May 4th movement responds to this settlement at Versailles. And this decision to hand that peninsula over to Japan sparks the protest, which is the May 4th movement. So the May 4th movement is anti Western, but it's also anti Japanese. And also, number two, there is within it an anti tradition sentiment. So you have amongst this young group that's coming through the May 4th movement, they're calling for China to break from its traditional practices. So you don't just have this anti Western, anti Japanese thing, which is what this course will focus on, but you also have this underlying sentiment of breaking from Chinese traditions, such as Confucianism, such as foot binding, and to usher in a more modern mindset for the Chinese culture. Now, this anti traditional mindset is going to be criticized by some of the older generation of leaders who want an independent China, but still want traditions to be maintained. But it's important to note that there is this emerging mindset to reject tradition that has been established in China for so long. This is why in the 1920s you start to see the end of foot binding. But what's going to happen is that China in the 1920s is going to start developing a political rivalry between the CCP, or the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party is going to be led by a man named Mao Zedong. And on the other side will be the Nationalist Party, which is also called the Kuomintang Party. So if you remember back to the revolution of 1911, there is a leader named Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And Dr. Sun Yat-sen had a vision of a modern China that is independent, but also industrialized. Dr. Sun Yat-sen represents that nationalist movement that's taking place in the 1920s. Dr. Sun Yat-sen will die, and it passes on to Chiang Kai-shek. So Chiang Kai-shek represents kind of this modern vision. But at the same time, Chiang Kai-shek is very wary of communism. So now you've got this communist versus nationalist group. Now, the Chinese communist philosophy said that they believed in the idea of an alternative vision, for the world. But the Chinese communist philosophy is anti-imperialist, and it's also pro-peasant. There's a big emphasis on harnessing the revolutionary power of the peasant. So if we follow communism, and this is a little bit of a side note, Karl Marx, who's the original communist, said that the factory workers were the ones who would lead this uprising of the lower class or the proletariat. Lenin comes along and Lenin says it's both the workers and the farmers. They're both equally screwed by the system. they both will rise up. It's what we call a dual class revolution. And that's why the symbol of the Soviet Union is the hammer and the sickle. Mao Zedong is going to change it further and say the power of revolution resides in the peasant. And that is now connecting the Chinese history and Chinese issues of land redistribution and the fact that China, for the most part, is still largely agrarian at this point. So you have this communist movement that is reaching out to the Chinese peasants. You have this nationalist movement that is trying to modernize and urbanize China, if you will. What happens in 1927 is that the Chinese Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai shek carries out a series of massacres against the communists. So, in a sense, they well, not in a sense, the nationalists attack the communists. And the communists go on what's called the Long March, which is, in a way, their efforts to evade and avoid the nationalist attacks. And the Long March will solidify the Chinese Communist Party. And now China breaks down in the 1930s into a civil war where you have the nationalists on one side and the communists on another. And the communists are going to be connecting with the peasants on this long march, solidifying support amongst the people of the countryside. Whereas the nationalists are going to be seen as more corrupt and more authoritarian. And we will play this out later in this course. All right, now we shift over to West Africa. In West Africa, the first thing you want to recognize is the impact Western education had on nationalist movements throughout Africa. So you have to remember, Africa is not one nation. Though there are pan African movements during the 1920s, we want to focus on the individual nationalist movements. The movement in Algeria, the movement in Kenya, the movement in Nigeria. There's going to be these independent nationalist movements taking place. And what they all have in common is that their leaders were educated in the West. So the leaders have been exposed to the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment. They've been exposed to this concept of social contract and self determination. But what these leaders are realizing, and what they start to use to justify independence, is that the racial hierarchy argument that social Darwinism advances is unacceptable. And in a sense, this is what World War I does. The African soldiers who go serve with the Europeans, they start to look at the Europeans and go, wait a minute, this is the superior culture. All their lives through the 19th century, Africans have been told that Europe is the superior culture. World War I shows that there is no superiority in the European culture. So after World War I, these Western educated leaders start to challenge the authority of the West throughout Africa. So in Kenya, we see one movement with Jomo Kenyatta, and another movement in Senegal, which is a French owned territory. Leopold Senghor becomes that leader. What both Kenyatta and Senghor have in common is that they were educated in European schools. One in London from Kenya as a British colony. So Kenyatta went to a London school, and Senghor went to a Paris school or a Parisian school. And they both learned those elements of liberalism and enlightenment, and they bring it back, and those ideas become the basis for anti colonialism. And that's not just happening in these two colonies, it's happening all throughout Africa. But another thing that's happening is that African laborers are starting to strike. And the motivations for these widespread spread strikes, particularly in West Africa, which is under French holdings, was one, because of the poor wages, two, because of discriminatory treatment. So what begins as a railroad strike quickly becomes a widespread strike. And in the 1940s, one of the results are concessions to the laborers, an improvement of conditions. And what these strikes show is that when there is unity against the West can be forced to change. So, what we're setting up here is the decolonization of Africa after World War II. This is where the groundwork is starting to form. And then our final place is in the Middle East. So during World War One, this is now becoming a consistent pattern. During World War One, the Arab people, the Arabians, helped the British and the French against the Ottoman Empire. So the Arabs hate the Ottoman Empire, they hate the Turkish culture, they want the Turkish culture out. So in a way, that's a form of nationalism. They side with the British and the French. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. But the British and the French are going to secretly divide up the Middle East. And that's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So, what the British and the French will do is divide up the lands that we recognize today as the Middle East. When this division happens after the Treaty of Versailles, the Arabs are understandably upset. And that alliance between the West and the Arabs falls apart. And the Arabs begin to harbor a much stronger anti-Western sentiment. We see this play out in Iraq. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Well, you can't because this is a recording. But what happens is the British go into Iraq and set up a government to administer this territory. And the people of Iraq rise up in resistance against the British presence. And the British are going to commit troops, they're going to commit military resources to try and suppress this uprising, and they're going to struggle to do it. So we see this strong backlash by the Arabs against the Western presence. The Arabs were expecting independence. And what they got was the British and the French taking the place of the Turks. And that was unacceptable. But another thing that's going to drive a wedge between the Arabs and the West is this issue of Israel. Now, between the interwar years, there is no Israeli state. There is the idea of Israel. And that brings me to the Zionist movement. So, starting in the 1890s, in Europe, there is a movement called the Zionist movement for European Jews to return to the Jewish homeland, which is modern state of Israel. So if you're interested, I'm going to tell you this real quick because it's an interesting piece of history. But the idea is that Abraham, who is seen as the father of the Jewish people, he's the patriarch of the Jewish people. His land was in Canaan, which is present day Israel. And according to the deal between Abraham and his God, Abraham and God made a deal, which was that the lands would pass down to Abraham's descendants. The Jews identify themselves as the descendants of Abraham. And Abraham has a son named Isaac. And in Jewish tradition, Isaac is the successor to Abraham. Now, there's also another son of Abraham called Ishmael. In Islamic tradition, Ishmael is the successor and the heir to Abraham. So what's happened is that by 1900, we have this region called Palestine, which is dominated by Muslims, by Arabs. They believe that land to be theirs. However, Jewish settlers are coming in from Europe and settling back in their homeland, which is the present state of Israel. And now a tension is emerging. The Jewish population and the Arab population are increasingly becoming volatile towards one another because they're both claiming the same land. The Zionist movement is growing in the 1910s and the 1920s. The British are going to take Palestine as their mandate. And the British will issue what's called the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration is where the British say, we are committed to creating a home state for the Jewish people here in Palestine. Of course, this home state will become Israel later. But the British, in a sense, are taking the side of the Jewish settlers. The Arab groups, the Palestinians in particular, don't like this. And that is going to develop a tension between the Arabs or the Palestinians and the Jewish settlers in what is now Palestine at the time, but will become Israel in 1948. So again, we're setting up stuff that's coming later. But the British are there kind of keeping this all under wraps. So that takes you through everything you might need to know. The basic idea is that there are lingering tensions in these colonial regions of the world: Africa, China, Korea, India, and the Middle East. And you could also throw in Vietnam, for example. Vietnam, they wanted to break away from the French, but the French didn't let them go. So there's a Vietnamese nationalist movement already underway. And it's not like these nationalist movements grew out of World War One. What these nationalist movements have become are much more anti-Western because they believe themselves to have been betrayed and ignored from the end of World War One. So if you keep that in mind, that big picture, you'll be okay with all the examples. So next time we will focus on World War Two, and we are just plugging along through the last bit of AP World History before we get to reviewing for the exam. So as always, bring your questions to the class, and you can always reach out by email if you want to follow up on anything later. Till next time, bye bye.